Grandma here, and we're reading Crispin by Avi. Before we get started, I want to talk to you a little bit about tone and mood in books. I'm going to read something that was in the previous chapter, and I want you to tell me how it makes you feel. Unable to sleep, I sat midst the swarming darkness, starting at every random rustling and cracking that came to ear. Then the wind began to moan, causing branches to stir and trees to creak and knock one upon another. These sounds were lanced by the hooting of the devil's own bird, an owl. Far worse were the sudden silences that suggested something lurking nearby. How does that make you feel? Can you get an idea of what Crispin was going through as he was in those woods all by himself at night? Did he feel like it was a friendly place to be, or was it frightening? The author has used words like causing the branches to stir and the wind began to moan, sounds like the devil's own bird, an owl. Something was lurking nearby. He uses those words in order to achieve a certain tone in the book. And that tone reflects in the mood and how you feel. We're going to be continuing this next chapter, paying attention to how the author has written this and what kind of mood he is creating for the reader. Chapter 13. Crispin now has left the village, and Aycliffe, his steward, is hunting him. Next morning, I awoke to the sound of galloping hooves. Greatly alarmed, I pressed myself upon the ground and lifted my head just enough to see the road. It was John Aycliffe, the steward, as well as the man I'd seen him with in the woods. The bailiff was there too. The three went racing by, sweeping quickly out of sight. "Oh, thank you, St. Giles," I whispered, "for protecting me." In a sweat from fright, I rolled upon my back and stared into the branches above. A cold rain was falling. The light was dim. Stiff in limb, chilled in bone, numb in thought, I shifted about. As I did, some tiny animals scurried into the underbrush. Oh, how I then wished that I could be such a wee creature small enough to hide so well. As I lay there, I remembered Goodwife Peregrine's pouch that hung about my neck. With a spurt of hope, I sat up and emptied the contents into my hand. To my dismay, it contained 3 seeds, one of wheat, one of barley, one of oats, plus my mother's cross of lead. Sorely disappointed, I tossed the seeds away, but decided to keep the cross in the pouch as the solitary connection to my past. If I hoped to live, I knew I could not return to Stromford, yet my fear of the open road was just as dire. What if I were to be seen by the steward? And beyond that, recalling Father Quinnell's description of towns and cities, I was too timid to press on. I, who had already gone farther from my home than I'd ever gone before. I, whose life had become so quickly altered. I, who had never really had to make important choices about anything. Now, I had to decide everything for myself. The result was that I stayed where I was. In truth, I dreaded going far from the road, lest I lose the muddy thread that connected me to the only life I knew. In faith, I did not know how to do otherwise. Thus, for the next 2 days, I kept to the forest, only now and then meandering off at short distances in search of food. All I found were acorns and bitter roots. All in all, I spent my time in an aimless, crushing sadness, consumed by an alternating dread and desire that I might be caught. If I were caught, at least my misery would have ended. It was during the afternoon of the second day that I saw the bailiff again upon the road. Alone he was, I supposed, heading back toward Stromford. While somewhat reassured, I wondered where the steward was. I could not help thinking he was waiting ahead for me. But once the bailiff passed, I made myself recall my mission, a need to get far from Stromford, to some city or town that had its own liberties. It was what Father Quinnell told me to do. Such thoughts forced me back upon the road, where I continued on. Sometimes I stumbled, sometimes I sat by the roadside, head tucked within my folded arms while waiting. I knew not for what. Then yet again, pushed by the need to act, to move, to do anything, I went on. Late that day, besieged by fears, very lonely and quite famished, I fell to my knees and prayed with deep-hearted, sobbing words. In these prayers I acknowledged my great unworthiness to my Lord Jesus and searched my heart for every sin to which I could confess. This time I begged him to gather me that I might join my mother in his holy heaven. The truth was, and how great my shame, I no longer wished to live, which was, I know, a sin. Chapter 14. On the third morning of my escape, I woke to a wool-like world of misty gray. Thick and clammy air embraced me like the fingers of some loathsome toad. Sounds were stifled, solid shapes were soft as rotten hay. No sun jeweled the sky. My entire world had shrunk down to the frayed margins of the sodden road. I walked as solitary as Adam before the creation of Eve. Some pretty disturbing images there. As I pressed on through the boundless mist, my damp feet sucking soggy soil, the road went up an incline. Suddenly I spied what appeared to be a man hovering in the air. Heart pounding, I halted and peered ahead. Was it a mortal? My first thought was that it was the steward. Or was it a ghost? A demon, perhaps? Or was it an angel come from heaven to take me to the safety of God's sweet embrace? Then, with a lurching heart, I realized what it was. A dead man swinging from the crossroads gallows. I drew close. It was a man, for so he had once been. Now his face was moldy green and much contorted with a protruding tongue of blue that reached his chin. One eye bulged grotesquely, the other was not there. His body oozed from open wounds. Swollen legs and arms flopped with distended disjointness. Bare feet pointed down with toes that curled upon themselves like chicken claws. Such clothing as he wore was nothing more than a loincloth of filthy rags. Sitting on his left shoulder were blue-black crows feasting on his corruption. He stank of death. A piece of writing was affixed to him by a broken arrow that stuck from his body. Since I couldn't read, I had no idea what it said. Terrified, I sank to my knees and made the sign of the cross. Perhaps there were some outlaws lurking near, but I thought it might be some thief brought to his lawful end. I tried to imagine what awful thing he must have done to deserve such a fate. Then with dread it came to me that God had set the man before me as a warning. The next thought that took hold was that I had already died, and that was the gate of hell. How long I stared at the corpse, I do not know. But as I knelt, the mist seemed to ensnare my body like a sticky shroud, intent on dragging me down. Except as Jesus is my Savior, as sure as my heart understood everything, I knew then how much I wished not to die, but to live. I can give no explanation how I came to this understanding, save that I did not want to become the blighted man who dangled before me, pillaged by the birds. Knowing how wondrous are the works of God, I thought that perhaps he, in his awful mercy, was speaking to me with this dreadful vision. For I knew that from that moment on, I was resolved to stay alive. But which of the crossroads was I to take? North? South? east or west? Please, dear God, I cried out, my eyes streaming hot tears, choose a path for me. In the end, I followed the path of the misty sun, which stared down at me from the gray sky like the dead man's blank and solitary eye. Chapter 15. All that day I continued walking. Nothing blocked my way. The mist lifted. The air turned light. Still I saw no one, not even from afar. From time to time I found streams to slake my thirst, but not so much as a crumb of food. Sometimes I traveled through woods. More oft I passed abandoned fields. While I saw birds aplenty, heard them too, wood pigeons, cuckoos, thrushes, I wondered if England had no human souls. Would I find no life or food anywhere? More than once I reminded myself of the times when my mother and I had gone without sustenance. If we could survive then, and we did, I could do so now. During the afternoon of the following day, still going westerly and while coming off a rise, I saw ahead what looked to be a village, situated in a dell. It was a cluster of cottages, and, taller than the rest, a church of stone. At first glance, it seemed as if the hamlet contained fewer dwellings than my own Stromford. Still, my heart began to race. Perhaps this is where God had led me, where I would gain my liberties, where people would treat me kindly, and where there would be food for me. Yet, as I drew close, I began to sense something greatly amiss. There was no rising smoke, no people, sheep, or cows. No living thing appeared, not so much as a single cock, goose, dog, or pig, nor were there smells. No dung, no manure. The fields I passed had long been unplowed. As I came into the village proper, I saw that all lay in ruin. Roofs were collapsed, walls had fallen in, carts and wheels were broken. Tools lay scattered on the ground. The roof thatch that remained was worn to shreds, full of gaping holes. House daubing had crumbled and remained unpatched. Wattle had unsprung. In the middle of the hamlet, I came upon a well whose surface water lay thick with clotted scum. My skin crawled with trepidation. Something ghastly had occurred. I was put to mind of my nightmarish thought that I had come to hell. But gradually I began to grasp what it was I'd come upon. The remnants of a village destroyed by the Great Plague of some years back. In Stromford there had been much talk of this devastating pestilence, the Great Mortality as it was called. Our village had lost more than half its inhabitants, some by death, some by desperate fleeing. It had caused my own father's death. The cause of this blight was well known. God had sent it as a punishment for our sins. All one could do was pray to Jesus and run, and even then there was no escape. As Father Quinnell had always warned, God in his sweet mercy and forgiving anger touches whom he wants. No soul can escape his wrath. Here, not one person appeared to have remained alive. The profound stillness that embraced all was its own sad and lonely sermon. Still desperate to find some food, even a tiny morsel, I crept with care through what remained, fearful my steps might awaken restless spirits. To protect myself, I gripped the cross of lead in my hand. In search of food, I made myself enter one of the better structures, an empty cottage with half a roof. Some of its walls remained. In a collapsed corner sat a brown-boned skeleton. About its open ribs lay shreds of old cloth. Once fair hair dangled from its skinless skull. Its fleshless hands clutched a tiny cross. I made the sign of the cross over my own hammering heart and retreated, then rushed through the village, wanting nothing more to flee. But as I was passing the broken church, I heard a solitary singing voice. Ah, dear God, how can this be that all things wear and waste away? Chapter 16. Startled, I stopped. Then I became afraid. After what I had witnessed in the village, I could not believe I was hearing a living voice. But when the voice sang out and I realized it was coming from the abandoned church, I told myself that a church was an unlikely place for evil spirits to abide. Besides, food was uppermost in my mind, and I had desperate hopes that I might have come upon a survivor. Trying to make no sound and clutching my cross of lead, I went around by the side of the church where windows had been, but where only gaping holes remained. As I drew closer, the voice sang out again. This time it was accompanied by the beating of what sounded like a drum. Oh, dear God, how can this be that all things wear and waste away? Cautiously, I peeked inside. At first, all I saw was rubble and rot. Partly hidden in the shadows, I saw a man who was anything but a skeleton. On the contrary, he was a mountain of flesh, a great barrel of a fellow whose arms and legs were as thick as tree limbs, and with a tub-like belly before all. Legs extended, he was sitting with his back propped against a crumbling baptismal font. He was, moreover, garbed like no man I'd ever seen before. Upon his head was a hat which seems to have been split into two, like the points on a cock's comb. At the end of these points hung bells. Moreover, the flaps of his hat came down along both sides of his face, encircling it, then tied below, making his cheeks plump. As for his face, most striking was a bushy beard of such ruddy red, it seemed as if the lower part of his face was aflame. He also had a large red and fleshy nose and hairy eyebrows of the same hue, as well as cherry-lipped mouth, big even for such a face as his. Now we're going to pause. With that description, does that sound like a horrible person, or does it sound a little bit more like Santa Claus with red hair? He wore a wide-sleeved tunic of black and ankle-length hose with a different color for each leg, one blue and the other red, though the colors were faded. His brown leather boots were long and somewhat pointy at the tips. Yet for all this rare color, his clothing was ragged, torn, and patched in many parts. Enough so that I could see his dirty, hairy skin in several spots. A Balak dagger was fastened to his hip. On the ground by his side lay a fat sack, which contained, I prayed, food. His eyes were closed, but clearly he was not asleep. Instead, he was singing raucously while beating a small drum with his massive hands. As I looked on, he continued to tap the drum with his big fingers, bleating out his song. After repeating the words a few more times, he let loose a booming laugh as if he'd just heard a rare jest. He laughed so hard he put down the drum and opened his eyes. Compared to the rest of him, those eyes were small and wet. Old pig's eyes, I thought, shrewd and wily. But what he must have seen was me staring at him, for he dropped his drum and his hand went right to his dagger. We gazed at one another in silence. "Good morrow, lad," he cried out, even as his hand eased off his weapon. "May God keep you well." "God be with you too, sir," I managed to say, though I was in awe of such a monstrous man. "And where, by St. Sixtus, do you come from?" he asked. "Not, I suppose, from this God-forsaken village?" I shook my head. "Then what place?" he said. "Far away," I answered evasively. "East or west?" I pointed in the direction I came from. Scrutinizing me, head cocked to one side, he ruffled his beard, with a sly smile played his lips. "You have a gifted way of speech," he said. "To what purpose do you travel?" I'm going to meet my father, I said, this being the answer I decided to give if asked. And pray tell, does your father, this father of yours, live close? In some large town. He considered me for yet a while with his shrewd, wet eyes. So I understand you, boy, he said at last. You know only somewhat from what you came, but go toward some other place. As God is true, sir. Do you have any idea how you look? No, sir. Your tunic is equal parts dirt, rags, and rints. Your face is scratched and mucked, as are your naked arms and legs. Your hair is long and unkempt, and I can barely count your fingers for the caked filth. In short, you're more cur than boy. How old are you? He asked. And as God is merciful, don't be so vague. 13, about. About, he returned with something like a sneer, plus another scratch of his beard. I said nothing, trying to make up my mind if I should run away, but still hoping that such a barrel of a man might have some food. I stopped. For his part, he continued to consider me steadily with his small, intense eyes. Might you, he said, as if reading my mind, be hungry? My mind began to water. Oh, yes, sir, as God is kind and if it pleases you. Hunger never pleases me, he roared. Though our great, if doddering king surely means well, his loyal subjects go hungry. And why? Because the officials of this most holy kingdom are all corrupt gluttons. His counselors and parliaments, all dressed in that new Italian cloth velvet, sit upon the backs of the poor and eat their fill of venison and sweetmeats, not to mention the Flemish foreigners who loot our country's gold. But such is the will of his gracious majesty that poor souls like you and I are not part of his daily reckoning. It is as it is his motto. Mine is, let it be as it may be. What think you of that sermon? He said, cocking his head as if he really wished me to reply. I didn't understand it, I said. Not at all? He asked, showing disappointment. It sounds like treason, I said, only to instantly regret my words. Sure enough, his face clouded with anger. Does it now? Making me jump. So be it. I hate all tyranny. Is that treason too? I did not dare to speak. Then, far softer, he said, well, by all the blessed saints and martyrs, what does it matter what I think? Come closer, I'll give you some bread. My hunger was so great that whatever prudence I might have had, I put aside. Instead, I returned my cross to my neck pouch, hurried around to the church's proper entry. I then approached the man where he sat, moving quickly when I saw he had untied the sack that lay by his side. With something close to elation, I saw him pull up a large gray lump of bread which he held up. I reached out toward it. The moment I did it, his free hand shot out, and with a speed that belied his bulk, he grabbed me by my waist, held me with the strength of stone. Well, we're going to stop there, but what do you think? Do you think this is a good guy or a bad guy based on how the author has described him? Well, we'll find out in the next chapter, won't we? Bye-bye.